The story begins with a boy on an island named Ayaga Island. Located on the northern side of Ogasawara Island, it was an isolated area with a population of only 110 people. The observation point he was at right now overlooked the entire island. Just then, a girl comes up to him, who was actually an elf. She asks him how her dress looks. She was his childhood friend, Wagiri Misaki, known in their community as a cosplayer. He clicks some photos of her, and she starts jumping around, saying that it was her own little dance, which left him a bit annoyed. Later, she changes back into normal clothes and asks him if he was a bit irritated from her. He tells her that it would be okay if she wore it to Comic It or something, even though he had never been there. Suddenly, she starts shouting that she wants to go there. However, he says to her that it's a bit dangerous. She did not seem to know, but in the city, unlike Ayagra Island, there were many traffic lights, and she states that traffic lights cannot be that dangerous. It was just not possible. But he tells her not to mock the traffic lights. In the first place, she misses the only set on the island in front of the elementary school, and he believed that she would definitely have an accident there. There was only one set of traffic lights on the island, installed for educational purposes. Even though it was meaningless if she simply ignored it, she simply says that because this was such an isolated place, it did not matter even if they ignore it. He then explains to her that she must stop walking before crossing the street and then gaze up with her eyes. It was a special skill that was difficult for them on Ayaga to obtain. Because of that, he tells her that she should just give up and go back home since this difficulty was too high for her. But then she starts yelling that she understands traffic lights very well and wants to go. So he then asks her if she actually has the money for that. First of all, the round trip was around 40,000 yen alone. Since the boat only made a round trip once a week, she needed another 40,000 for a hotel as well. Then there was food and shopping, for which he guessed that she would need about 100,000 yen total. She was surprised to see that he calculated all that so quickly, and he admits to her that he once wanted to go to a burger stop. Therefore, he tried to work out how much it would cost beforehand. They then head back, but along the way, she starts to chicken. So he asks her what was wrong, and with bright eyes, she asks him back if he was also interested in leaving this island. Hearing that, he gets a bit embarrassed but still confesses that he would like to go somewhere else occasionally. However, he also believed that to people from the mainland, their village was basically a different world. Misaki, on the other hand, states that she found it nice, thinking of their island as a different world. Also, she believed that with magic and elves, it would be even more fun. He tells her that if there was magic, it would be dangerous. However, she says to him that if they had it, then she could summon him to herself and could always help him, while he thinks to himself that everyone always helps him out because his father was not here anymore. She then asks him how the sword was that she asked for, and he briefs her that he just needs to finish shaping it. Then he could finally paint it. Hearing that, she gets excited and praises him that he had definitely mastered the blacksmith skills. Yuta, on the other hand, contemplates that blacksmith was also a decent occupation. The next day, just as he was about to leave after finishing his work, all of a sudden, a girl comes up to him and says that she has been looking for her. That girl was Misaki's older sister, Wagirin Hakuhana, aged 24 years old. Although she looked like an elementary school student, she was the village head secretary at the village office, and she was terrified if someone made her angry. He asks her what she was doing there, and she questions him back if that is how he thanks someone for getting him a job. But he tells her that he was still just in training. Putting that aside, he again asks her why did she come to see him and if they were going to the coast, to which she excitedly replies that they will take her car, which was, in fact, a wreck on its own. He starts to think that even though she loves driving, she really should not be allowed to. Since he had no other choice, he decided to go along. Inside, Misaki was there too, who was quite excited to swim in the sea too. With that said, the three of them head out. They finally arrive at the coast, and Yuta was still trembling as he was sure he was going to die in that car. Misaki also reminds that everyone calls it the rolling coffin for a reason. She then decides to go swimming and starts removing her clothes, while he, on the other hand, gets shy and covers his eyes. However, she teases him and asks if he was expecting something else, as she had a school swimsuit underneath already. He remained embarrassed, and she continued to tease him while doing a leopard pose as he tried his best to ignore it. He then shows her the sword they talked about earlier. Even though it was almost finished, it was not quite as good as he wanted it to be. But Misaki was simply amazed to see it since it looked so real. She starts fantasizing if she could beat a dragon with it, while he questions her where she was going to find a dragon in the first place. Later, after swimming a lot, she suggests to him that they should just return home now. However, he tells her that he wanted to do a little more work on her sword first. So she then invites him to her house to have dinner together and also tells him to get back as soon as possible since her dad gets lonely without him. Hearing that, he started to wonder what it would be like if his father had not died. Then thinks about the time when he ran away from the house and from his father. But he then looks at his watch and it was already 6 o'clock, so he decides to head back. All of a sudden, he notices that fog has started appearing around him, and he hears a girl screaming. When he looked past the fog, there was a girl with elf ears, and he wondered if it was a foreign cosplayer. She questions him what does a cosplayer mean, and he was even more shocked seeing that she does not know that. However, he asks her why she was screaming earlier, and she tells him to run away quickly as well. She questions him that even though he knows about elves, why does he not know about her? Just as he was about to say something, he saw a huge monster right behind them chasing after them, and he was completely stunned. It turns out, a dragon was attacking the Ayaga village, and as they continued running away from it, he wondered if it was still looking for them. He asks the elf who the hell she was, as he had not seen her on Ayaga Island before. She apologizes to him for surprising him, explaining that she was using the mind-reading ability of the elves right now. She was manipulating her mental wavelengths to speak directly to his heart, and she could even use this to communicate in an unknown language. He just stood there, thinking if she was joking or something. She further introduces herself as Excelia Lilgardo and says that he seems to be from a different world since she came from Ungurin. That light combat dragon was also from that empire, and they wanted her to marry one of their nobles. Confused, he asks her what kind of setting is all this, and she replies that she was not making any of this up while also questioning him if he did not see that dragon earlier. Yuta thinks to himself that maybe this was not his world since he could not deny it after seeing that dragon. Suddenly, she notices the sword on his back and states that it looks like a great blacksmith's masterpiece, while he tries to explain to her that it was just for cosplay. However, addressing him as a knight, she requests him to lend her his sword. To wield such a sword, she truly believed that he must be a wonderful knight, and he gets all nervous as he tries to explain to her that he was just a high school student. But she had no idea what he was talking about and asked if that was the name of his order or something. Putting that aside, he introduces himself to her, and she also prioritizes getting out of there before that dragon finds them. He asks her if she couldn't defeat it, and she tells him there was no way she could fight such a monster. But then he also notices that she has been trembling for a while now, so he takes her hand, and they both get a bit awkward. All of a sudden, the dragon finds them out, and Excelia quickly steps in to protect Yuta, telling him to run away from there. However, he tells her not to move from there as he decides to be a decoy instead and lures the dragon away from her. He starts running away, and the dragon continues to chase after him. However, Yuta then realizes that the direction he was heading to was actually where the Ayaga village was. Thinking about his aunt, uncle, Hakuhana, and Misaki, he knew that he needed to stop that dragon right there and started to wonder what he could do. He lures the dragon to a cliff, and as he stands behind it, the dragon charges at him to attack him. But then Yuta uses a lighter and a spray to create a sort of fire magic and burns the dragon's face. While doing so, he thinks to himself that when creating cosplay tools, they must be very cautious about fire. It was normal to prepare the shape of the tool using softwood or cardboard, and spray paints contained chemicals that were easily ignitable. So, if you were to make even a small mistake, it could easily result in a large fire. And that's just what he did. However, Excelia from afar tells him to run away because setting fire to a dragon was not going to hurt it. Yuta also knew that fire would not work against a dragon, as that was common sense in an RPG, and he was indeed expecting that to be the case. His opponent was an agile dragon, and he understood that it would avoid the spray no matter how he aimed. Therefore, he attacked a bit with fire first to make it less cautious. Then, as it charged at him to attack once again and was not alert, he used a chemical spray attack right at it. He then takes out his sword, and while the dragon is still off guard, he uses his Excalibur to attack it from behind and pushes it down the cliff. Relieved, he lies on the ground as he finally defeats a dragon. And meanwhile, Excelia, who was still worried for him and did not know what was happening, Yuta comes up to her, and she was relieved after seeing him all right. And so, on the island where he lives, a new world had come. Excelia expresses how amazed she was seeing him, what he just did, and was also surprised to see such a powerful spell. The spell that robs the target of its vision through a silver mist, and he tries to explain to her that it was just spray paint. However, she was in her own thoughts and asked him if he was a user of essence magic since it was an ultimate spell that transcends the 4 major magical elements. But he tells her that it's something entirely different. He further states that he was quite surprised to find out that elves and dragons exist. However, she tells him that she was not an elf, which was quite embarrassing for her. She was of mixed blood between humans and elves, a half-elf. Yuta, on the other hand, inquires if she was still basically an elf, and she explains to him that half-elves were hated by both humans and elves. But he says that he does not care about any of that and asks her if she does not have any confidence in herself, as he was sure there were plenty of people who still liked her. Hearing that, she gets a little emotional and promises to do her best from now on. He then touches her ears and asks if they were real. However, she gets extremely sensitive and tells him not to touch her ears so suddenly. He apologizes to her, but then suddenly she remembers that she does not have time for this as she needs to see her mother right away. She requests him to lend her his power, and they both head to a castle. Yuta could not believe what he was seeing and wondered if he was dreaming. She tells him there was no reason to be that surprised since, using magic, they had moved the whole peninsula, which, in fact, left him even more shocked. She says that they can talk about it later, and then they enter a room where all of a sudden, a girl tries to attack him with her sword, and he manages to block her on time. She states that he has no right to approach the princess, and that he would simply become a rust on her sword. But Excelia stops her and says that if she does that, she would not forgive her since that man was a brave warrior, and her savior who defeated the Empire's light combat dragon with a single blow when she was being persuaded by it. Hearing that he saved her, she realizes that she had made a mistake and then decides to stab herself in panic as she apologizes for being born. And Yuta stops her, saying that there's no need for that. She then introduces herself as Ververine Elcross, and she had been taking care of the princess since she was young. Whether it was security, assassination, reading about nighttime techniques, or even washing her underwear, she took care of all that. Excelia adds that Ververine's family had served them for generations, telling him that he could ask her anything he wanted. But first, she wanted to go and see her mother, so the two of them arrive in her room. And there, the mother thanks him for saving her daughter and introduces herself as Isabella Lilgardo. Even though she was the lord of this place, she had no power and, therefore, now her daughter was acting on her behalf. Confused, he asks Excelia what happened to her father, and she says that her father passed away when she was a kid. He quickly apologizes to her and tells her that it was the same for him as well. He then asks if her mother was sick, and the mother briefs him that she used a spell that transports to another world in exchange for life force. He questions her why she would do something like that, and she explains to him that this was a settlement for those who were fleeing persecution because the lord here fled an elf village after marrying a human and everyone living there had some sort of circumstances. She had lived and worked with these people for many years, but then came the Sehel Empire. It was an emerging military state with extremist ideas. Several years ago, they attacked this land, Lilgard, and in order to escape the threat, they had to take some countermeasures. She tells Yuta to look outside the window, and there he sees a huge dark fog in the middle of the ocean. Isabella further explains that that was the boundary with another world, and since she was short on magic, she could not complete the separation, and hence, that thing appeared. She shows him the shackles that were tied to her feet and says without them, she could finish the spell. When she was young, she was caught by slavers, and at that time, she was saved by her future husband. However, these could not be taken off as the key was lost. On this fetter, there was a curse that seals the power of the elves, and that is why she was always in a weakened state. Yuta inquires if the fetters were removed, would she get healthier again? And she says yes, but it was a forbidden magic and so, it could not be completely reversed. Yuta inspects the fetters and then states that he should be able to remove those, leaving both of them a bit surprised. Even though the shackles seemed quite sturdy, he noticed that the clasps were only a few millimeters thick and hence, he was sure he could cut them. The mother tells him that so far, no one has managed to do it, but then Excelia asks her to just believe in him since he protected her from a dragon all by himself. The mother listens to her daughter, and Yuta gets to work, and then just after a little while, he successfully breaks the shackles and frees her from them. Both of them were left shocked, and Isabella asks him what sacred treasure he used, to which he replies that it was just a simple bolt cutter. Since it was her first time hearing about it, she says that it was very nice while Yuta stood there and thought that they were simple tools sold in hardware stores. Excelia, on the other hand, tells her mother that he was a brilliant man, and she also agreed as her lifespan had increased by about 700 years because of him. Yuta was glad to help them out, but then the two of them start whispering about something and then they request him to stay at the castle for tonight. He remained a bit hesitant, but Excelia then clings to him and asks if he's fine with it, and so he agrees to stay. At night, when he was in his room, he looks at his phone, and there were no signals, which left him thinking if Misaki was mad right now. Just then, Excelia comes into his room and sits beside him on the bed. He gets a bit nervous seeing her like that, but then she expresses that she was very happy today because she gets to be the wife of such a wonderful person. She hugs him and says that her small body was really happy to meet her, while Yuta, on the other hand, had no idea what she was talking about and panics. He stops her right there and asks her why she was saying things like that, and she tells him that's because he proposed to him earlier. He touched her ears as soon as they met, and then after a while, she decided to accept it as well. He had no idea that touching ears meant proposing to someone, and he started panicking. But then she asks him what they should do now. He remains confused, and she tells him that she was taught that she should leave everything to her husband on the first night. So she promises to do her best as it was her first job as a wife. Yuta then asks her if she knew how babies were made, and Axilia had no idea what he was talking about. He realizes that she has zero knowledge about that kind of stuff, and given that there were only females around her, he guesses that it was not really surprising. But still, he believed that sleeping with someone who does not understand it was a crime. So, he shifts the topic and suggests that they should get to know each other a little more first. However, she says that it was not necessary, and besides, her mother was also married when she was of her age. Realizing that he cannot apply common sense here, he decides to just bluntly turn her down, and so, he tells her that they both cannot get married. Tears start falling down her eyes, and she asks him if he does not like her. He, who had never dealt with a crying girl before, tries to explain to her that he did not mean that he does not care. In that case, she questions him whether he likes her or not, and he answers that he does like her. But before he could finish, she told him to take her as his new, young, and beloved wife, and with her heart and soul, she promised to do her best. She jumps on him, and he tries to stop her from getting too close, but he unintentionally touches her chest, and then completely loses it. She, on the other hand, wanted more and tried to get close to him, but he just panics and faints away while she calls Ververine to help her out. The next morning, he finally wakes up, and she briefs him that he had been sleeping all morning. He was glad to hear that nothing happened in the end between them, but then she starts clinging to him and says that they were a couple now. Later, as he was leaving the castle, he sees that Misaki was coming running towards him, and she quickly questions him where he has been, even though he said he would be back for dinner, and she was worried sick for him. He apologizes to her, but she was just glad to see that he was safe. Just then, Hakuhana also comes there and asks him if he was alright, while Axilia stood there and wondered if these two girls were his brides. They both notice her, and Misaki quickly hugs her, saying that she was super cute, and with such shiny hair, the cuteness level was just too high. Seeing her acting like that, Hakuhana smacks her on the head and tells her to cut it out. And since this was not going to help, she asks Yuta if he knows anything about the current situation. He explains everything to them along with Axilia, and that she was a half-elf. Hakuhana could not believe what he just said and states that if this goes wrong, it could harm the entire country. Nonetheless, they needed to prepare quickly, and she suggested returning to the office and reporting to the mayor. However, Axilia tells them they cannot go as Yuta was her husband, and he must not leave Lilgard. Hearing that, both of them were left shocked, as she further says that last night, they made a couple's contract, and her body and mind already belonged to him now. She also whispers to him that her mother said that in a situation like this, she should always do as much damage to the opposing women as possible, and he thinks if she was a genius or something. Meanwhile, Misaki, on the other hand, looks at him menacingly, and she questions him if he was actually enjoying himself with such a beautiful girl while they were worried for him all night. Terrified, he tries to explain to her that that's not what happened. But then she suddenly shifts her mood and says that, of course, that cannot be right, because according to her imagination, she believed he would have just attacked such a beautiful girl. However, jokes apart, she did not want to leave such a poor child alone, and plus it seemed like Yuta really made an impression on her. He once again tells her that it's not like that, and she just thanks him for finding her the cosplay comrade that she was looking for all this time. He asks her if she has any idea about international affairs, and she teases him that he must be thinking of some solutions, either way, to which he answers that she's wrong. But then, on a serious note, she tells him that even though she does not really believe it, she got the feeling that he wants to stay there. And he answers that it was not like that at all, because Ayaga village was his home. Since that was the case, she states that he would better tell Axilia that, and he agrees to do so right away. He goes up to her, and she excitedly asks him if he was finished talking. But then he musters up the strength and tells her that he has to go home now. Misaki backs him up and says that he was a part of their family, and hence, they request her to let him go. She starts crying and states that if he has to go, then she would go with him, leaving all three of them shocked. The scene then shifts to Nagatacho, Tokyo, where the council was discussing the part of the different world that had appeared within their territorial waters. They were frustrated since this happened right before the House of Representative election, and there was no option but to procrastinate. They decided to do a basic field survey first, and for that, they had the perfect person amongst their staff. They summon a girl and tell her that they looked forward to the results. Her name was Yumori. Coming back to Yuta, he was finally back in his home, sleeping peacefully when suddenly, he feels someone besides him. He wakes up and sees Axelia on her bed, wishing him a good morning. He panics and questions her why she was there, and she replies that it's because she was his wife. He tells her to just get out of there for now as he needed to change his clothes, and he could not do that with her there. However, she, on the other hand, starts changing in front of him. She could not untie her buttons, so she calls Ververine, and in an instant, she comes there, leaving Yuta even more shocked. He asks her why the hell was she there, and she simply replies that he should not be worried about that. Coming back to Axelia, she tells her she could not undo her button, so Ververine helps her out, and Yuta tells them not to do that stuff in there. However, she says that there was nothing wrong since she was his wife, and besides, even if they were alone, she was sure that he would not have the guts to do something. No matter how long he was given, he would never make any progress, and he just thought why was he being insulted by her. He leaves the room, and then later, after freshening up, he wondered if this is what it was going to be like for the rest of his life. In the kitchen, he sees Misaki, and he asks her why she was there. She tells him that she was asked by her sister to look after Axelia and him. So he then inquires where Hakuhana was, and she says that she was at the office since she seemed to be very busy with something. That was to be expected since they made contact with a country from another world, and that country's princess had moved in next door, so of course, she would be busy. Yuta then expresses that he was really hungry, and Misaki had prepared some rice while she was waiting for him. But just then, Axelia and Ververine also enter the room and say that they have never smelled something like this in their world. Misaki was quickly amazed and asks him who she was, and he introduces Ververine as a female knight and one of Axelia's servants. Misaki found her very cool and she asks her if she could say something like just kill me. Confused, Ververine questions him if it is customary in this country to ask those they have just met to harm them, and he explains to her that was not the case. This one was just special. They all sat together to have breakfast, and even though Axelia did not want to admit it, she was also hungry. So he and Misaki offer her the rice as well, and they all eat together. The moment Axelia tasted the rice, she could not believe how delicious it was, and Ververine also found it very delicious. They continue eating without stopping even for a second, and Yuta tells her if she eats that quickly, she will get sick. However, she replies that he was wrong and embarrassingly states that she was not hungry. Confused, both he and Misaki look at her, and Misaki starts laughing, saying that she found it very delightful that someone would eat her food so happily as she served her another bowl. Yuta, on the other hand, thinks to himself that at first, he was a little worried, but it seems that it would be fine for now. Misaki then notices that he left his vegetables, so she tells him to finish those, otherwise, he won't get anything else. She had also cooked some fish, so he said that he would eat the vegetables with it. But Axelia, on the other hand, seeing the two of them like that, she slams the table and yells that she was going home now. He had no idea what he did, and Misaki, on the other hand, apologizes to her, saying that it's always like this. She tells Yuta to say sorry to her as well, and he apologizes to her even though he did not understand what he did. She was clearly mad at him, and he wondered if he did something wrong. He then switches the topic and brings up that he heard they were banned from entering the other world. So he asks Misaki if she knew anything about it, and she responds that she does not understand it very well either since it was an instruction from the government and not the office. Worried, Axelia questions what would happen to them, and he says that he was sure someone from the office would come and explain it sooner or later. She tells them there were lots of people in Lilgard who needed help, and she had hoped that it would help to get Yuta's support. And he started thinking that that was a problem. All of a sudden, Hakuhana comes back and asks if Yuta was awake. She had brought Yumori with her, and just as she was about to introduce her, Yumori gave him her card. He sees that she was from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and asks her what she actually does, to which she answers that it was mainly information communication and statistical firefighting. On top of that, she was in charge of managing local autonomy. So he then inquires what someone from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication wants from them, and she explains to him that they had a job for him. She gets straight to the point and tells him that as a local civil servant, the so-called Ogasawara, Special Protected Area, she requests him to become the lord of this region. He panics and tells her that the lords were Isabella and Excelia, but then Excelia says that he was already a lord of Lilgard. Confused, he asks her when did that happen since he did not agree to anything like that, and she states that it was the shared property of a married couple. She questions him if he likes her or not, and since he could not really answer that, Yumori comments that it seems the way to help Lilgard has now been lost forever. Having no other option, he agrees to become the lord, and Excelia happily hugs him. However, he wanted to know what would happen to his school since he would have to manage 3 things at once now, and Yumori assured him there was no need to worry about school as she would have him act as an intern at the village office. They had no idea what an intern meant, so Hakuhana explained to him that she meant an internship, which was basically a system to study how to act in a real workspace. Since it was studying, it was an acceptable reason to take a break from school, and hearing that, Yuta was a bit relieved. Having said that, Yumori wanted to know the situation within Lilgard, so she asks Excelia if she could tell her about it, and she agrees to do so. The scene then shifts to Yuta and Excelia together on a horse, and she questions him if he likes the scenery of Lilgard. He nervously says that he does, thinking to himself that apparently, the one holding the reins would normally sit at the back of the horse. However, if he were to sit at the front, he could not see what's ahead. She then asks him if he was feeling cold even though she was quite warm, and he tells her that he was fine. But in his mind, he kept thinking that this 2-person ride was really dangerous. As they strolled around, he noticed that the people on the field were really thin, and Excelia explained to him that Lilgard was a poor land, and on top of that, they had to pay a lot of tax to a neighboring land for protection. Hearing that, he felt really bad for them. Later, they come back home, and Niseki asks him how Lilgard was, and he answers that it was not very good. Yumori, on the other hand, comments that, in fact, it's the opposite because given the circumstances, without Excelia, the situation would just get even worse. Although it was clear there were some measures they needed to take, she wrote down 3 major objectives and what they needed to focus on: secure food supply, improve sanitation, and recover agricultural production. She suggests prioritizing the food supply first, and Yuta contemplates that it was easy for her to say. Even on Ayaga, the declining population has made maintaining the farmland more difficult, and so he wondered if it was really possible to help the town from another world. She starts off with Lilgard's food supply and asks Excelia how much food was stockpiled in the castle. Excelia replies that they used up the last of it a few days ago, and all that was left was firewood for heating. Yuta recalls the time when he stayed there for the night and asks if he was the reason they ran out of food. Excelia remains silent, and he realizes that she has been hiding her hunger this whole time, caring about him so much that she didn't eat, even during the time with the luxurious cuisine they offered him. He inquires from Yumori if they could use some of the government's funds to buy food, and she answers that they cannot do that until after the election. The national government was hamstrung, but the municipality could provide some funds. Yuta questions if that means they can ask the village office, but Hakuhana states that the village office is already low on funds. Yumori asks why, and Hakuhana explains that the village office receives very little money, so they have to maintain a tight budget. Small municipalities like theirs could apply for a supplementary budget, but it takes several months to get approved. To receive a subsidy, she would have to apply some pressure within the organization. Excelia asks how long it would take until Lilgard gets help, and Yumori answers that it would probably take a month. Excelia believes that people would starve to death by then, and Yuta knows they don't have that kind of food stored. Just then, Niseki suggests they do have some food. They had a few days' worth, and if they wanted to prepare a large amount of food, she believed there was a way. Yuta questions if she's joking because there were hundreds of people in Lilgard, but she reminds him of the disaster drill in school where the mayor mentioned stockpiles of food in preparation for an emergency. Later, they go to Lilgard, telling everyone to gather around as they have miso soup, a Japanese food not found in their world. Everyone is delighted with the meal, and Yuta feels proud that they managed to do something in the end. Excelia calls him out and shows him the food she cooked, herring pie. Berberine caught the fish for the dish, and Excelia, trying hard as his wife, cooked it. He says it looks delicious and decides to eat it to make her happy. After eating it, he feels something wrong with his body but tells Excelia that the food was extremely delicious. She decides to make even more next time just for him, but suddenly he starts sneezing. She asks if he was feeling cold, but he was rather feeling hot and then collapses on the ground. He later wakes up in his room and sees Yumori by his side. He asks her if she was nursing him this whole time, and she says that this was expected, given that she was, in fact, borrowing one of his rooms. Due to her sudden dispatch, accommodation was not prepared for her, so she thanks him as this was of great help, and he assures her not to worry since he was the only one living there anyway. He then questions her why she was dressed up as a nurse, and she tells him that these were from Misaki, who kept on saying, "Don't you want a nursing outfit?" According to her, this outfit was the most suitable for carrying out a nurse's tasks, and Misaki made some very reasonable arguments for it. Yuta, on the other hand, thought that she was very naive. All of a sudden, he pulls out a thermometer from inside his shirt and briefs him that his fever has gone down considerably, so she does not have to worry anymore. But still, she suggested that he rest for today as they were really lucky it was just a cold. In the event of unknown pathogens being detected in the special region, she tells him that the whole of Ayaga would have to be quarantined. He asks her if they were going to get a doctor soon, and she says that that would be difficult until the country decides its position. The government was still undecided on whether or not to regard the special protected area as part of Japan, and because of that, passports were a problem. She explains to him that a passport was something for immigration control and refugee recognition. Any Japanese citizen leaving Japan must possess a valid passport, and lastly, they must also obtain confirmation of departure from an immigration official. For the government to dispatch a doctor to the special protected area, it must be clarified whether they require a passport or not. He asks her if they cannot dispatch a doctor just because of that, and she explains to him that it was a more serious problem than he understands. For instance, if a temporary passport was created for the special protected area, that would mean they were accepting that the special protected area is not a part of Japan. She requests him to understand that the ownership of that land was a very sensitive issue. However, he questions if that's really a problem since they had been going back and forth at will. She tells him that it's a good question, and the government was not actually aware of any of the actions they were taking. Shocked, he asks her if that means they were breaking the law, and she simply says that they have neither violated nor complied with the law. The government was not involved and was going to deny any knowledge of this. Just then, Misaki and Excelia also enter the room, and they ask him if he was all right. Both of them were dressed up as nurses as well, and Misaki tells him to just look at Excelia since she was too cute in the nurse dress. Excelia, on the other hand, points him out and questions where exactly he was looking. Misaki then checks up on him and asks him why he was that cold. Excelia brings out a bottle, thinking that this should help, and then explains to him that this was something she brought for him. It was the Lilgardo family's secret all-purpose medicine, and she prepares that medicine for him. They ask her if it was really effective, and she states that if a sickness did not heal after having surgery to remove the bad blood or purifying the body with mercury, then just rest overnight after drinking this. He drinks the medicine, and Yumori, on the other hand, thinks about what she just said. Things like mercury treatment and phlebotomy of the local medical treatment were this bad, she truly believed that they needed to take some preventive measures before there was an outbreak of a serious disease. Hence, the improvement of sanitation was essential. Meanwhile, Misaki asks him if he took a bath yesterday, and he says that the last time was before he collapsed yesterday. So she uses that chance and tells Excelia that it was the wife's job to wipe down her husband's body when he catches a cold. She and Yumori hold him down while they tell Excelia to go for it. However, he was struggling too much for her, so she calls Ververine, and she suddenly pops from under the bed. She was dressed up as a nurse as well, and she felt like she was being watched by a pervert, but nonetheless, she held him down, and Excelia proceeded to do her best for him as his wife, and he just sat there shouting. Later at night, while he and Hakuhana were together, he asks her if she has any ideas about the sanitation problem, but she had none. So he then tells her that he has an idea on how to improve sanitation in Lilgard. The most time-efficient method for improving public health was to popularize proper hand-washing techniques. He had tried teaching Excelia that before, but sadly, they only made a little progress. However, even washing hands was difficult as there was not enough water, so he admits that he was in trouble. When they ran out of water, they always had to get more water from the river, so they could not regularly wash their hands as well. And it was impossible to create a water source too. However, Hakuhana, on the other hand, stops him right there and questions him why he was talking about work when he could be drinking sake with her. She gets a bit too close to him when suddenly Excelia comes in, and she tells her to stay away from him while she asks him why he was letting her do that to him. But Hakuhana states that this was nothing, and in fact, they used to take baths together. Annoyed, Excelia starts yelling at him and once again tells her to just stay away from him. So Hakuhana then questions her if she was getting jealous of her, and she gets all red-faced. Just like that, they both start arguing while Yuta just sits there and thinks about Hakuhana's bad drinking habits. When she gets drunk, she indiscriminately tries to do anything to her opponent, so he tells her that she has had enough for today. But she says that it's fine since red wine contains polyphenols, and he reminds her that she was drinking sake. In response, she tells him to just shut up and argues that all alcohol was good and alcohol was the best medicine. Just then, something clicks in his mind, and he gets an idea about using an alcohol spray. He recalls that in historical dramas, they put alcohol on wounds, and with that logic, alcohol could be used to disinfect hands even if they have no water. There were always a lot of them around for cleaning the office windows, so he could easily obtain them. And that was just the idea he wanted. Some time had passed, and Lilgard's food problem had been solved in the short term, while the sanitation situation had also improved a bit. Now, they needed to look at the crops. From talking with Excelia, he learned that Lilgard used the 3-field farming system. They split their farmlands into 3 sections, one for summer crops, one for winter crops, and one for livestock. These sections were rotated. Yumori suggests that, for the time being, the priority has to be the harvest. Since the climate of the other world appeared to be quite different from theirs, she was worried about how the crops were growing. Excelia expresses that she agrees with her, as the land was quite barren to begin with, and the fields were being affected by the heat. Yuta recalls that she once said she could use spirit magic, so he asks her if there was a spell that could lower the temperature. She answers that there was a magic that produces ice, but it was too hot. Yumori then mentions that modern farming methods could grow tropical crops in northern regions. However, she had never heard of the opposite being done, and he agrees with her. He thinks about something like using a tent to trap the heat, but just then, he gets an idea and tells Excelia to get as many people as possible. Later, the people had started building something, and Yumori asked Yuta what he was thinking, so he explains to her that the tent's skeleton was just lying in Ayaga. He got the vinyl from a farmer who was planning to throw it away, so even in Lilgard, a tent could be built fairly easily. Next up was Excelia's turn, and she starts casting a spell. All of a sudden, the air pressure was dropping, and Yumori guesses that it was probably using evaporation. He admits that spirit magic really was useful, and she tells him that changing the temperature like this does not consume much magic power, so it was fairly easy. He then thinks about the time when he and Excelia formed the contract, and at that time, her mother thanked him for saving her daughter. She gave him a spirit and said that even though it was not used to humans, it was rare and also quite obedient. With this, he could now use magic, and he was just overwhelmed, wondering if that means he's a wizard now. Excelia, on the other hand, asks him if he normally makes things while imagining the outcome because otherwise, he would not be able to acquire the magic to make things. It was rare for a human, but she could sense that spirit magic in him, and she believed that must be the reason for it. If he could clearly convey his image, then the effect of the magic was surely going to increase as well. He questions her if it takes time to be able to use magic, and she answers that it totally depends on the attribute. For instance, wind attribute spells were difficult to use but required little magical energy as air was easy to move. Conversely, earth attribute spells were easy to use as the form was clear, but it required a lot of magical energy. To give him an example, she shows him an earth attribute spell on a twig. It was a simple enhancement magic, but because of that, the twig was now as strong as iron. She asks him to tap it against something, and so he does that, and to his surprise, it even sounded like iron. She tells him that practice was necessary to do this, but she truly believed that he would be able to learn this type of thing quite quickly. Cut back to the present, looking at Excelia using magic like that. He did not think that he would be able to do it like her. Now all they needed to do was just wait for the harvest when all of a sudden, Misaki comes up to him running. He asks her what's the rush, and she informs him that there was a typhoon heading for Ayaga. They headed back home where the news channels were reporting about the approaching typhoon. Excelia asks Misaki if a typhoon was really that bad, and she says to her that they really were. If they didn't do something, the crops would also be destroyed. And hearing that, she gets very worried. Yuta also thinks that Lilgard was barely tall and was very weak against strong winds. But then Yumori comes in and questions if they could harvest the crops before the typhoon arrives somehow, and he tells her that it was impossible to do that. Everything was done by hand there, and there was just not enough time. On top of that, access to Lilgard was restricted, so they could not bring in some machinery as well. However, there was one thing that they could try. They come back to the farming fields, and he asks Excelia to use spirit magic and to make a big wall around the fields so that they could use the earth to block the winds of the typhoon. She successfully does that, and Misaki was amazed to see some real magic while he hoped for this plan to work. Later at night, when he was sleeping, Oxelia comes rushing to his room and informs him that the wind spirit was saying that the field was in danger. They rush towards the field, and the winds are really strong. He asks Oxelia if she could raise the walls. However, there was nothing she could do because if she raised it any higher, it would collapse. He tries to think if there was anything they could do because if not, the field was going to be destroyed. Just then, Ververine also comes there and states that it was too early to throw in the towel. She wanted to protect the princess and the citizens of Lilgard using that iron will of his, and hearing the word iron, he remembers when Oxelia showed him that twig as strong as iron. He quickly tells her to use that magic she demonstrated to him earlier, and she asks if he was talking about the enhancement magic. He suggests using that on wheat to make it sturdy down to the roots so that it does not fall down. She proceeds to do that and uses the earth spirit to make all the crops sturdy. Later, the scene shifts to Yuta sitting in the bathtub, and he was glad that the typhoon changed direction earlier than expected, and he shouldn't have to worry about it anymore tonight. Just then, Oxelia also enters the bath as she was told by Ververine that Japan had a tradition that a husband and wife should bathe together. She expresses that Japanese baths were the best and then sits beside him while he was just dying from embarrassment. She then goes on to tell him that she had been thinking he was a very wonderful person. From the first time they met, he showed incredible bravery, wisdom, and courage. He had saved them so many times, and in comparison to that, when she was with him and Misaki, it was fun indeed. But even though the citizens were in trouble, she did not do anything at all. She realized after he became the Lord that she could not be protected forever just because she became the Lord's wife. She wanted to stay by his side, however, she needed to do what she should as the daughter of the previous Lord. And so, she tells him that she was not qualified to be his wife. But still, she loved him more than anything else and more than anyone. She asks him what he think of her, and just as he was about to say to her, she gets dizzy from the hot water and starts sinking. He panics, and Ververine comes out of nowhere and then takes Oxelia with her while he just stands there all embarrassed. The next morning, they noticed that the fog was thinning, and the typhoon did not bring any rain after all. Oxelia points out that it seems like the water level in the river they use was decreasing, and she believed that it may be that the source, the lake of the water dragon, may be beginning to dry up. Yuta asks her what's a water dragon, and she explains to him that it was the guardian of Lilgard. Lord Water Dragon protected Lilgard from the outside world with a thick fog, and hearing that, Misaki quickly jumps and states that she wanted to see Lord Water Dragon. She agrees to show her where to find him, but then she expresses that she was also a bit worried. Yuta decides to join them as well since he was worried about the water too, and when they finally arrive at the lake, Misaki was amazed to see the water dragon, and Yuta just contemplated that it was more like a leviathan even though he thought it would be something like Nessie. However, he notices that Oxelia was just frozen in place, and she says that it was really bad as she had no idea that the lake would have dried up this much. The water dragon could only live in water, but if it stayed like this, she was worried that it would get steadily weaker, and then eventually it would die. She wondered perhaps that is why the mist around Lilgard was getting thinner, and was sure that this was caused by the water dragon being weakened. She mentions that it had gotten worse very quickly since she came there only recently, and he also agreed that it seems quite bad. She then tells Yuta that she had been protected by everyone in Lilgard. While suffering persecution, leaning against each other, she was always supported by them, and therefore she wanted to protect the people of Lilgard this time instead. And for that, she begs him to lend her his power. He simply smiles at her and says that they cannot leave it like this. He starts patting her and decides to head back for now and then come back with a plan. They explain everything to Yumori, and if nothing was done, Oxelia was sure that the water dragon would only have a few more days to live. Yumori, on the other hand, tells them that there was another problem. The fog had special characteristics, and any M-waves from outside the fog could enter. However, it blocked any M-wave from inside escaping. In other words, as the fog thins, other countries would become aware of the existence of another world. The special protected area was undefended, and if an organization from another land landed, it would create a crisis for Japan and Lilgard. For the sake of Japan, it was necessary to restore the Lake of the Water Dragon. They needed to create a plan to help the water dragon. However, the village office did not have enough time nor money for it, and on top of that, their legal basis was too weak to get Japan's help. They had to do this on their own, so they tried using an awning or an ice magic, but that did not solve the problem. If the rain did not come soon, he was afraid that there would be no water, but only rocks. Just thinking about it made him very frustrated. Later, Misaki asks her sister if they could use that machine which they used when they had water shortage to turn seawater into fresh water, and she inquires if she means the seawater desalination system. She explains to them that it was borrowed from the other country, and so it has to be ordered from the inner area. However, Yumori mentions that even if they were to use the flying boat from their neighboring country, it would still take over half a day due to the procedures. Also, SDF aircraft could not be used by civilians without good reasons, and despite the current situation, their legal basis was still weak. Thinking about air transport, he asks Excelia if it would be possible to move it with flying magic, and she says that it was very weak magic. Just then, Misaki gets an idea and suggests Excelia use the teleportation magic that she used to go between the two islands instantly. However, she tells her that she could only travel to places she had been before using the transfer magic. Misaki gets disappointed, but Yuta on the other hand thinks of something and reminds Misaki about Union. She asks him if they were really going to do the Union, and he explains to all of them that since the portable seawater desalination system could be moved with transfer magic, the strategy was something like this. Excelia could run out of magic before she could fly that far, and since transfer magic could only move between places she has been, they were going to use the flight magic to hold on to the flying boat, and then they could come home using transfer magic. Yumori also agreed with him that it might work. And so, Hakuhana decides to place the order right away while Yuta takes Excelia as they needed to prepare as well to save the water dragon. The plan was finally in motion as Yuta and Excelia found themselves in the flying boat, and he thought that if they were grabbing onto the outside of an aircraft, at 6,000 meters, it would be below freezing outside. So Excelia used her ice magic to make an ice dome attached to the fuselage of the aircraft, and the temperature inside the dome was kept constant due to Snow's insulating abilities. Excelia hugs him and asks him why he was trembling so much as she further states that she remembers when she first met him. When he stopped her from trembling in fear of that dragon, she questioned him why was he risking so much, why did he help her, why did he do so much for Lilgard, and why was he going so far. He answers that it's because he would feel uncomfortable if he did not, so she then asks him if that was the only reason. He was a kind person indeed, but she could not help but feel that there was something else as well. She begins crying and says that she was worried about him as she requests him to open his mind just a little more. Yuta holds her and starts explaining to her about his dad. His father was dead, and he died in an accident. However, it was not just an accident. His dad had not returned home for his birthday, so he told him, "I hate you, Dad." That night, a typhoon hit the island for the first time in years, and he ran and hid in a salt factory in the mountains. He quickly came to regret it, and he was on the verge of panicking when suddenly, his father found him. His father hugged him tightly, and until that point, he had never thought of his father as reliable. His father, who was supported by everyone and was dedicated to the island, the only thing in his world was his great father. He apologized to him for making him feel lonely until now, and was truly sorry. But that night, his father gave his life for him. An important person just suddenly disappeared, and that is why he wanted to prove that he was right to give his life to save him. Just like she said that she was not worthy for him, he also believed that for his father, he was not worthy. But Excelia stops him right there and hugs him. She says to him that he was truly a brave person and no matter what is said, to live his life for someone else, he was the same as his father. And hearing that, he begins to cry. They finally arrive, and at one point, he was even worried that they would not get it. It was a rule that they needed the mayor's signature to prove that they really need it, otherwise, they would not lend it. However, it had already been dealt with by Hakuhana and from there on out, it was quite easy. They finally get their hands on the portable seawater desalination equipment, and with that, the water dragon lord was going to be alright. Excelia was also exhausted since she used a bit too much of her magical power, but still asks if there was anything else she could do. And he tells her that it's fine and to just leave it to him from there on out. A seawater desalination plant was a device that desalinates water by filtering seawater. After installing the outpost hose, it was now time for the intake hose, which he needed to submerge into seawater. However, as he tried to do so, he finds out that the hose was too short. It was just a few more meters, but he did not want to move that stupid equipment. He could get Excelia to draw the seawater in with her magic. However, he could not ask her to do that right now. He remembers when she said to him that he was a very brave man, and so he decides to handle this on his own because he had magic too and he was contracted with a spirit for a reason. He tries hard to form an image in his mind since Excelia said the image was important. He starts imagining her at first, but that was not the time for that. So he tries making a stronger image and a clearer image. He finally does it and successfully puts the hose in the water. He takes a sigh of relief when all of a sudden Excelia comes up to him and tells him that the water dragon had water now. But then she sees what he had imagined in front of him, and she yells at him asking why the hell did he make her naked body, and he tries to explain that he had to reshape the coast to make a space for the hose. Just then, Misaki and Hakuhana also come there along with Yumori, and they say everything seems to have worked out. The fog was recovering, and the threat of another country intervening had passed, and for that, Yumori praised the two of them. Yuta then wondered where Ververine was since she would usually be the first one to appear. And suddenly she pops out of the lake and asks him for an explanation of Excelia's stone statue while Misaki and Hakuhana also look at him menacingly, demanding an explanation. Excelia, on the other hand, with a smile on her face, simply thanked him for everything. Some time had passed, and the scene then shifted to Yuta's household where Misaki and Excelia were trying out the mermaid cosplay outfits, and Misaki believed that it really suited Excelia. She then looks at Yuta and says to him that there were supposed to be mermaids in Japan, but she does not believe it. In response, he just asks her if she was going back to Lilgard since there were still some things left to do, and she tells him that there was nothing she could do in Lilgard. She then gets back on the topic of mermaids and states that mermaids draw ships to them with magical songs, and they were also said to have the power to sink ships. She believed that fishermen would be up in arms if they were seen in Lilgard, and Yuta just thinks that mermaids were surprisingly scary. Just then, Yumori comes in, and she asks him if she could have a minute. She starts off by congratulating him on the other day's work. However, she brings up that if they could just communicate smoothly, it would not have been such a problem. Compared to others, he was also well aware that his communication with her was lacking even though they lived under the same roof. He apologizes to her, and she then further states that he always calls everyone else by their given name. So she tells him that her name was Miu and asks him if he could call her that from now on. He gets a bit nervous as she starts coming close to him and says that she wanted to build a friendly relationship with him. So, he agrees to do so and calls her by her name, which makes her really happy. Just then, he gets a phone call from Hakuhana, and she informs him there was a big problem. Lilgard's fishermen were in violation of the fisheries law. Their fishermen were fishing in a forbidden area where the Fishermen's Association owned the right to fish there. Because of that, the Fishermen's Association was going to be furious seeing a foreign group without a fishing permit fishing in their water. He asks her if they can actually be arrested for that, and she tells him he does not need to worry about that since the other party was from another world after all. The policies of this country could not be applied to others. However, while they won't be arrested, they were not allowed to fish either. And so, she says to him that he has to solve this problem since it was his job as the Lord. Later, after consulting with Mu, in order not to infringe on the fishing right, changing where they were fishing was the easiest method. Lilgard's ship could not move that far from the coast, but they could train Lilgard's fishermen to use Japanese boats. Misaki points out that they would still be catching the same fish, though the fishermen's profits would be reduced, and Excelia also agreed. So she questions if it does not matter if there were more fishing boats as long as the amount of fish caught increases, and Yuta tells her that yes, that won't be a problem. In that case, she knew a way, and then suddenly, she called out to a creature from under the water. Its name was Maron, and Yuta and Misaki were just shocked to see that it could speak. Excelia asks him if she could talk to some of the fishermen tomorrow, and then the scene shifts to the next day where they were together with the fishermen. Maron was there to help them out, and as they proceeded to catch some fish, she helped them from under the water, and to their surprise, they actually managed to get a big catch. Maron helped drive the fish into the nets, and that is why Lilgard's fishermen were able to catch so many fishes thanks to the hard work of Maron and the fishermen. At first, Yuta was a bit worried. However, the fishermen seemed to have gotten used to Maron sooner than expected. He was still amazed to see that they were catching twice as much fish as normal, and there was no way this fishing technique could be beaten even by modern fishing methods. It was a win-win situation, and so he thanks Excelia, and she says that she was just happy to have him praise her. It was all sorted out for the time being. However, there was still one problem. They were going to have difficulties communicating because they could not talk to each other. The other world did not know Japanese, and they were using Excelia's spirit magic just to be able to talk to people. Misaki also understands his point and hoped that there was a place where they could learn the other world's language, a place where they could teach each other their world's language, and basically wished they had a school while Excelia asks them what was a school. They get back home, and Misaki shows her the photos from when Yuta was a kid. She then asks her if she now understands what a school was, and Excelia simply answers that school was a wonderful place, which was to be expected of Japan. Yuta, on the other hand, tells her that it was not that amazing since there were tests and all. Plus, in Ungling, it was rare to receive an education, and only royalties and some aristocrats were educated. Celia then expresses that Japan really seemed to be a legendary utopia as everyone was learning together equally. She could get any job regardless of family or status. She says to him that she wishes there was a school in Lilgard as well. The intellects that were hiding amongst her people, she wanted to give them hope for the future, and therefore she started requesting him. He also agreed that a school was a necessity indeed, and if they could make a school in Lilgard and give them the same education that a Japanese person would receive, then Lilgard may become prosperous like Japan. And so, they decide to make a school while he starts reforming the education of another world. However, later when they discussed the same with Mew, she straight up rejected them and said that just because they want something does not mean they will always get it. In the first place, there were a myriad of barriers to establishing a school-like building, teachers, equipment, and she asked him what he was planning to do about them. They would need to meet the needs of the residents of the special protected area, and make allowances for their valuable culture. It was also possible that giving them a Japanese-style education could be considered cultural invasion. Misaki questions, isn't it fine if Yuta unilaterally made a school? And Mui asks her what does she mean by that. Misaki says that there was no deep meaning in that, it's just that, rather than only teaching on this side, they could teach everyone together. Mui remained confused, but then she grabbed her hand and told her that friends help each other out, and they were friends too. Hearing that, Mui gets very shy, and then after calming down a little, she understood that they were friends indeed, and for friends, a school was indispensable. So, as their friend, she promises to use her full power to assist them, and Misaki was glad to see she came around so fast while Yuta just wondered if she had any friends at all. To start making a school, first, they borrowed a room in Lilgard Castle from Isabella to use as a classroom. Then they created desks and chairs using Axelia's magic. Blackboards could not be made using magic, however, they were able to get some blackboard paint from Ayaga Village School. Somehow, they were able to prepare everything, and they were finally ready. They just needed to get the children here for lessons. But then he thought who would teach the classes. Just then, Mui and Axelia enter the room dressed up as teachers, and he asks Misaki if they really needed to cosplay for this test run, to which she replies that it was important to set the mood. He tells Mui to just start from the basics and imagine that she was teaching elementary school students. So, she starts teaching about the elementary particle and how it was the smallest unit of any substance. She also starts discussing the superstring theory of fundamental physics, and he stops her right there as this was not what he meant by basis. He then asks Axelia to give it a try, and she excitedly decides to start another world class in order for everyone to understand the other world. In the other world's language, yes was Su and no was Jai. Hence, she decides to ask them some questions where they must answer with Su or Jai, and Yuta was impressed to see that she was actually taking this seriously. For the first question, she walks up to him and asks him if he promises to love his wife for all his life, which catches him off guard, and he just yells Su. He questions her why was she saying things like that in a classroom, and she just states that the thought of hidden love of a teacher and pupil made her very excited. He realizes that all this was just useless as Axelia always gets carried away while Misaki and Ververine have no idea how to teach in the first place. Mui, on the other hand, was dissatisfied with her class, and it was just too difficult for her. Seeing her like that, Yuta comes up to her and tells her that she does not need to do everything by herself and could leave the school classes to them because they were friends after all. Hearing the word friends, she gets excited once again and says that she would trust her friends and leave the important role of the teacher up to them. The three of them, on the other hand, just stood there surprised, seeing how quickly she recovered after hearing friends. Misaki also leaves it up to him and wishes him luck while reminding him of the time when the teacher asked him to tutor some of the lower grade classes. Axelia, on the other hand, was just happy to see that there would finally be a school in Lilgard. Just then, Hakuhana also came in to see how it was going. He and Misaki showed her their preparations, and they believed that it was going well and were going to be ready soon. The only thing left to do was to tell the citizens that they were opening a school now. But then, Hakuhana tells them that they have not thought this through exactly. They only had a room of supplies and equipment, and bluntly says that they were being a bit naive. Both of them ask her why she was thinking like that, and she explains to them that the service they were trying to establish, regardless of whether it was done by the Lord or the village office, ultimately, they would have to convince each one of the inhabitants. They did not even know who was a resident there, and plus there were no documents about that either. So basically, every person they were going to meet from now on was a person they would have to convince. Having said that, she decided to go back while the three of them just stood there all confused. It took a while for her words to sink in because at that time, They did not understand what they really meant. After some time, in the Lilgard castle, the school had finally begun. However, someone had to watch his little brother while some were not allowed to come after getting into a fight with their dad. Each of them had their own circumstances, and so many children were already upset. When Yuta explained the importance of education to the residents, the reaction was not at all positive, and they argued that they do their utmost just to live their day-to-day life. Even though he tried so hard to explain the importance of school, it turned out to be of no use. Celia then suggests him to try going from house to house since Hakuhana said that talking face-to-face with each resident might reveal the reasons why their children were absent. So, he decides to do that and arrives in front of their first house whose entrance looked like that of a toy house. He calls out to them, and the resident annoyingly opens the door, yelling that they were too loud. The person introduces himself as Borog, the half-dwarf blacksmith. Yuta was surprised to see a dwarf for the first time, and Borog asks the new lord what he could do for them. He tells him that there was a child there who should be in school right now, and Borog states that he was fine without that sort of thing. He did not need an education so that he could mimic nobility, and he believed that kind of head dust was useless for smithing. Yuta tries to explain that's not true, but he shuts the door and goes back inside. Celia explains to him that Lilgard's citizens were very wary of change, and she was told that her mother also had difficulties. She wanted Misaki to be there as well, but she was being made to do her summer vacation homework. Just then, a little boy came up to them, and he looked very nervous. Celia introduces him as Ashura, Tashika Ruaru's eldest son. She asks him what's wrong, and he tells them to come to his home. When they reach his home, he goes up to his sister who was laying on the bed and informs her that he brought Mr. Husband. Yuta compliments her hair, light blue hair which looked like a gem, but then a lady comes in and tells him that she was her daughter, Farah, and she inherited her hair color. She introduces herself as Ashura and Farah's mother. Her husband was out fishing, and she states that they were indebted to him for helping them the other day. She tells Fiera to give her greetings as well, and she politely greets them both. Ashura then informs him that his sister was sick, and she always gets sick without water. That's why the mother went out to get some water to help her. Yuta asks him why did he want him to see his sister, but then Farah gets all embarrassed and stops her brother from saying anything unnecessary, and starts chasing after him. However, she suddenly got sick again and needed water immediately. Later, they sat beside a lake, and Ashura explains to them that his sister was talking about going to school every day, but then the well dried up, so she and his mother stayed at home while he had to climb this hill to draw water. That is why he could not attend school, because the water source dried up after the transition. Hearing that, Yuta simply pats him and says that he will do something about it since he wanted these children to attend the school. With that said, he calls upon the spirits of the earth and tries to magically cut the hills to make a waterway, but nothing happens, and it does not move at all. Celia explains to him that the earth there was very compact, and so it was very difficult to use earth magic. However, he refuses to give up and says that he still had magic power. She tries to stop him by telling him that it would only put too much of a burden on his body, but still he keeps on trying. Suddenly, Ashura also yells at him and asks him to stop right away. Yuta says to him that if he were to combine his power with Celia, then there was a chance 1 or 2 waterways might appear, but he just tells them that it was enough. To begin with, he believed that it was crazy to go this far for him, and even though he could not go to school, just knowing that it was made by him, he was sure that it must be a good thing. He promises that he and Farah would always support him, and he just runs away. Later, he meets up with Misaki, and he asks her what she was doing, to which she replies that it was too hot to do her homework, so she was just playing in the water. He gets very annoyed seeing her do stuff like that even though there was a water shortage. However, Mew also comes in and states in this heat, it was reasonable to bathe in water to cool down. Celia also stood there, still thinking about Ashura when they asked her if she wanted to get in too. Misaki offers her a swimsuit and tells her that she does not need to make such a complicated face, but then she suddenly trips because of the pipe, and all that water from the pipe just started getting wasted. And Yuta just stood there, lost in his own thoughts after seeing all that wasted water. Later, Celia gathers everyone up, and the villagers ask them what on earth were they planning now, when all of a sudden Ashura arrives there and tells them that he put the mouth of the hose in the water. The villagers had no idea what it was that he was carrying, and Ashura further states that he borrowed a hose from Ayaga just like Yuta requested. It took them 3 days and nights to dig a waterway near the village, and since the soil was softer near the village, it really saved them. Misaki asks him what they were going to do now that they had successfully created the waterway, and Yuta gets to work. He puts the hose into the water, and then Celia follows up with using her Spirit of the Water spell. Misaki questions him if he was trying to use magic as a substitute for a pump, and he explains to her that that was not the case. She was just getting the water to start flowing through the hose. But the water was only going to flow temporarily, or so Misaki thought. However, Axelia tells them that she was done, and when they go to take a look over the hill, she was shocked to see that the water was still flowing. She asks them if they installed a machine somewhere using magic, but Miu explains to her that it was the siphon principle. By connecting two containers of liquid with a liquid-filled tube, they could get liquids to flow up as long as their overall direction was down. When Misaki tripped over the hose, Yuta noticed that water was leaving the pool, and if it could get out of the pool. With that logic, he thought that the same could be done with this hill. Surprised, Misaki questions him when did he learn all that, and he simply says that it was middle school science. However, hearing the word middle school, all the villagers start asking him if it was like school. With this, they did not have to go to the river constantly, and they could also expect a bigger harvest this year. The women were also complaining that they could not wash, and they started discussing that their children also go to school. Axelia takes that opportunity and tells everyone that this was school's education. School was a place for solving problems without magic, and as Ashura learnt, an education would lead to great fortune for their children. She looks at him and says that she was glad to see that he would no longer have to worry about the water, and with this, he could go to school as well. He gets emotional and thanks her for everything, while Yuta on the other hand thought to himself that they were only able to get the water to start flowing thanks to magic. But still he was fine with what she said. The next day, everyone came to school and it was a great success. Hakuhana also comes in and states that creating a waterway using knowledge gained at school actually managed to convince the residents. She tells him that if he talked face to face with each of the residents, his feeling would naturally be transmitted. However, it was not something that she could do, and for that, she praises him. Misaki starts teaching the students that when she gives them an order, they must follow it, and so she instructs them to stand, bow, and then say thank you very much, while Yuta tells them that it was supposed to be done at the end. As time passed on, the school continued to run smoothly, and Yuta was surprised to see that Farah was quite the fast learner. After the class ended, he goes up to her and expresses that it was great that she was able to come to school, and in response, she and Ashura both thank him since it was all because of him. Ashura teases her and says that now she could see him every day, and she just shuts him up. But then, a student from the back asks him what he thinks of Farah. The boy introduces himself as the blacksmith's son, Zakusu, and Yuta recalls that he must be from Borog's place. He expresses that he wanted to come to school for a while, but he was only able to thanks to Farah's father. Ashura also adds that it's because they were both at school. He was able to become friends with Zakusu, and for that, he thanks Yuta. Hearing everyone calling him young master, he reminds everyone that they are supposed to call him sensei, and not young master. However, they had no idea what that word meant. So, he explains to them that in a Japanese school, the people who teach were called sensei, and they quickly understand that and start calling him that. At first, the residents were skeptical of education. However, ever since the water problem was solved, all of them were convinced to send their children to school. Education had only just begun, but it was going very well. Classes where they were using cartoons as teaching materials were very popular among the children. To ensure that the children were getting the necessary nutrients as lunch, Miu managed to procure some rice that was scheduled to be discarded. A few days later, they noticed Farah with a new hairstyle, so Axelia asks her about it, and she says that it was because her sensei said he liked ponytails while reading that manga yesterday, and he remembers that he did say something like that. Axelia compliments her that she looks good in it. But then Farah inquires if he was Axelia's husband, and she excitedly answers that he was indeed her husband. So, Farah then states that she would like to be his mistress, and hearing that, all of them were completely shocked. Misaki says to him that this was a pure mess, and he tells her not to be stupid since Farah was just an 8-year-old child. The age difference was just too great, but she reminds him that the manga they read in class the day before yesterday said that age doesn't matter if they were in love. Axelia tries to explain to her that mistress was kind of a different thing, but then she suddenly asks if it could be that he was not interested in women. Hearing that, Axelia also mentions that he certainly did not show a reaction even though she was constantly appealing to him. And just thinking about it, she starts screaming that she never thought he liked the same sex and then runs far away while he just stood there, not knowing what to say. Later, as he and Misaki took a walk, she continued laughing at him and pulled his leg while he said to her that it was not funny at all. She tells him to calm down since she knew that he was interested in girls because whenever they got in the bath together after middle school, he always stared at her, and he asked her to just stop right there. She then switches the topic and brings up that it had been a while since they went home together like this. However, she understood that it was different since he was a lord now. He says that it was difficult for him as well, and she understood that completely and was happy to see that he was doing his best. She mentions how they had always been together, and so there was something she wanted to say to him, but then all of a sudden, Farah interrupts them. She tells him that she had been waiting for him, so he asks her if there was something that she does not understand in her studies, but she says to him that it was her birthday tomorrow. So, she holds his hand and states that she wanted him to come and meet her mom and dad. Misaki supports her and convinces him that he must go since tomorrow was a day off in the first place and it was just like a home visit. So, he happily accepted her invitation, which made Farah overjoyed, and she thanked him as she took her leave.